The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Marfa, Texas, as Theresa Bennett clutched her tattered shawl around her shoulders and stared at the smoldering ruins of what had once been her family's general store. It had taken the Dawson Gang less than an hour to destroy everything she had spent 23 years building: her home, her livelihood, and worst of all, her hope. The year was 1879, and the harsh realities of the Texas frontier had finally caught up with the young woman who had once believed that hard work and determination were enough to carve out a life in this unforgiving land. The store had been her father's dream, passed down to her when consumption had taken him just 2 winters ago. Now it was nothing but ashes and broken dreams. Theresa's honey-brown hair fell in tangled waves around her dirt-streaked face as she sank to her knees in the middle of the street. The few townspeople brave enough to venture out after the gang had ridden off kept their distance, their sympathetic glances doing nothing to ease her pain. "Miss Bennett, you should come away from here," Sheriff Walters said gently, his weathered hand lightly touching her shoulder. "There's nothing more to be done tonight." "Where am I supposed to go?" Theresa whispered, her voice cracking. "They took everything from me." The sheriff had no answer. The small room she'd kept above the store was gone, along with every possession she'd ever owned. The gang had even taken the strong box containing the month's earnings, and her mother's locket, the only thing she had left to remember her by. "Miss Porter's boarding house," the sheriff began, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the gathering darkness, the silhouette growing more distinct as it approached. The rider wore a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, snorted and pawed at the ground as the stranger reined it to a halt several paces from where Theresa knelt. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the dirt. He approached slowly, his face gradually becoming visible in the dying light. Theresa looked up through tear-filled eyes at a man unlike any she'd seen in Marfa before. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the sun, with a strong jaw covered in dark stubble. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, and his eyes, piercing blue like a summer sky, seemed to look straight through her. "The Dawson Gang," he stated more than asked, his voice deep and quiet. Sheriff Walters stepped forward. "You know them?" The stranger nodded once, his gaze never leaving Theresa's face. "Been tracking them across 3 territories." He knelt down beside her, removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair with a touch of silver at the temples. "Name's Kieran Donovan, madam." "They took everything from me," she sobbed, the words catching in her throat as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The cowboy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears. "I'll give you everything back." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the unwavering determination, made Theresa look up and truly see him. In that moment, she felt the faintest spark of something she'd thought had been extinguished forever. Hope. "How?" she managed to ask. Kieran Donovan rose to his feet and replaced his hat. "First, we need to get you somewhere safe for the night." He turned to Sheriff Walters. "Is there a place she can stay?" "Miss Porter's boarding house has a spare room," the sheriff confirmed. "But it ain't free," and Kieran reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it to the sheriff, who caught it with a surprised expression. The clink of coins was unmistakable. "That should cover a week," Kieran said, "and meals." Theresa struggled to her feet, her pride momentarily overwhelming her despair. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Donovan." The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's not charity, Miss Bennett. Consider it an advance payment." Payment for what? She asked warily. Your knowledge of the Dawson Gang, he replied. You've seen them up close. You know their faces, their voices, how many there were. That's information I need. Sheriff Walters cleared his throat. Now see here, Donovan. Miss Bennett has been through enough. I can't allow you to drag her into some personal vendetta. It's not personal, Kieran cut him off, though something in his eyes suggested otherwise. And I'm not dragging her anywhere. The decision is hers. He turned back to Theresa. But I promise you this. I will find them, and I will recover what they took from you. Theresa looked from the smoldering ruins of her store to the mysterious cowboy standing before her. She had nothing left to lose. Why would you help me? She asked, her voice steadier now. You don't even know me. I know enough, Kieran replied. I know you're someone who's lost everything to men who take because they can, because they think no one will stop them. His jaw tightened. They're wrong. In that moment, Theresa made her decision. She squared her shoulders and wiped the last tears from her face. Very well, Mr. Donovan. I accept your advance payment, and I'll tell you everything I know about the men who destroyed my life. The following morning, Theresa sat across from Kieran Donovan in the small dining room of Miss Porter's boarding house. She had slept little, plagued by nightmares of the previous day's violence, but had managed to wash away the soot and dirt that had covered her. Her borrowed dress was plain but clean, and she had pulled her honey-brown hair back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Kieran looked much as he had the night before, though he'd removed his duster. His cotton shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing strong forearms marked with old scars. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the worn holster containing a Colt revolver that looked as though it had seen extensive use. Tell me everything, he said as Miss Porter placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of each of them. Start from the beginning. Theresa took a deep breath. It was just past noon. Business had been slow, so I was taking inventory in the back when I heard the horses. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering. There were 6 of them. They came in laughing, asking for whiskey. When I told them we only sold dry goods, not liquor, their leader, a man with a red bandana and a scar through his eyebrow, said they'd take whatever they wanted. Kieran nodded. Jack Dawson. They started helping themselves to my merchandise. When I protested, one of them, a thin man with yellow teeth, grabbed me. Her hand unconsciously went to her wrist, where faint bruises were visible. I fought back. That's when they got angry. You're brave, Kieran said quietly. Most people wouldn't have resisted. I'm foolish, Theresa corrected him. If I just let them take what they wanted, maybe my store would still be standing. Kieran shook his head. Men like the Dawsons don't stop taking. If not your store, they would have found another reason to destroy it. He leaned forward. What happened next? The leader, Dawson, found my strongbox under the counter. There wasn't much money, but it was all I had, when he found my mother's locket inside. She paused, swallowing hard. I begged him not to take it. It's the only thing I have left of her. That's when he smiled and said they'd take everything. Her voice faltered. They poured oil on the floor and set it alight as they left. Kieran's face remained impassive, but Theresa noticed his knuckles turning white where he gripped his coffee cup. Did you hear them say where they were headed next? Theresa nodded. The yellow-toothed one mentioned something about the Silver Creek mine, said they had unfinished business there. A flash of recognition crossed Kieran's face. Silver Creek is a day's ride west of here. You know it. I know of it, he replied. Small mining operation. Owner's been trying to make a go of it for years. Mr. Donovan, Theresa said hesitantly, you said you've been tracking these men. May I ask why? For a long moment he was silent, as if deciding how much to share. Finally, he said, 3 months ago they raided a settlement in the Oklahoma Territory, a small place not even on most maps. They took everything of value, killed anyone who resisted. His eyes met hers, including my brother and his wife. Theresa's hand flew to her mouth. I'm so sorry. Their son survived, Kieran continued. My nephew, 7 years old, I found him hiding in a root cellar, hadn't made a sound for 2 days. His jaw tightened. He's with my sister in Denver now, safe. And you've been after the Dawsons ever since, Theresa concluded. Kieran nodded once. The law can't or won't touch them. They move too fast, cross too many jurisdictional lines, so I've been following their trail, gathering evidence, learning their patterns. He set down his cup. And now they've led me here. What do you intend to do when you find them? Theresa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. First, I intend to recover what they've stolen from you and others. His eyes held hers steadily. As for what happens to them after that, depends on whether they choose to surrender to the proper authorities. And if they don't. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, but there was no humor in his expression. Then I'll do what needs to be done. Theresa studied him across the table. There was something dangerous about Kieran Donovan, a barely contained intensity that both unnerved and fascinated her. Yet there was also a sense of honor about him, a dedication to justice that went beyond mere vengeance. I want to go with you, she said suddenly, surprising even herself. Kieran's eyebrows rose. That's not happening. Why not? It's my property they stole, my life they destroyed. It's too dangerous, he stated flatly. These men are killers. I know that better than most, she countered. And I'm not asking to join a gunfight, but I deserve to be there when you recover my mother's locket, if you recover it. When, he corrected her. Not if. When then, she agreed. Either way, I'm not content to sit here in Marfa while you ride off to face them alone. Kieran leaned back in his chair, studying her with those piercing blue eyes. You're stubborn, Miss Bennett. I've had to be, she replied simply. After a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. We leave at first light tomorrow. I'll secure a horse for you. I can ride, Theresa assured him. Can you shoot? He asked. She hesitated. My father taught me the basics with his old rifle. Basics won't be enough if things go wrong, Kieran said grimly. We'll practice today. And you'll follow my instructions without question. First sign of trouble, you stay back. Understood? Theresa wanted to argue but recognized the logic in his conditions. Understood. As Kieran stood to leave, she called after him. Mr. Donovan, he turned back. Thank you, she said softly, for giving me a chance to take back what's mine. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps. Get some rest, Miss Bennett. Tomorrow will be a long day. The sun had barely crested the eastern horizon when Theresa met Kieran at the livery stable the next morning. She had exchanged the borrowed dress for a practical riding outfit. A simple blouse, sturdy skirt split for riding, and a worn leather jacket she'd purchased from the widow Johnson for a promise of repayment once she was back on her feet. Kieran was already saddling 2 horses, his black stallion and a dappled mare that watched Theresa with intelligent brown eyes. This is Penny, he said, patting the mare's neck. She's steady and sure-footed, should serve you well. Theresa approached the horse, letting her sniff her hand before gently stroking her nose. She's beautiful. And already paid for, Kieran added, along with the supplies. He nodded towards several saddlebags already packed and secured. You're very generous with your advance payments, Mr. Donovan, Theresa observed. He shrugged. Money's of no use if you're dead, and I intend to stay very much alive until my business with the Dawsons is concluded. A philosophy I share, Theresa said, checking Penny's saddle before mounting with practiced ease. If Kieran was impressed by her horsemanship, he didn't show it. They rode out of Marfa as the town was just beginning to stir, heading west along the trail that would take them towards Silver Creek. For the first hour, They rode in companionable silence, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a hawk the only sounds breaking the morning stillness. "How did you learn to ride so well?" Kieran finally asked, breaking the silence. "My father raised horses before he opened the store," Theresa explained. "I practically grew up in the saddle. When Mother died, he couldn't manage both the ranch and raising me alone, so he sold the horses and bought the store in town. You miss it, the ranch life?" Theresa considered the question. "Sometimes. There's a freedom to it that you don't find in town, but the store was good for us, stable." She gave a bitter laugh. "Or so I thought." "Nothing's truly stable out here," Kieran said. "The West makes promises it doesn't always keep." "Is that why you came out here?" Theresa asked. "For promises?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, madam, I came because I had nowhere else to go." "What were you before you became?" She gestured vaguely at him, his gun, his obvious skill as a tracker. "I was a lawman," he said simply. "Federal marshal out of St. Louis for 7 years. You're not anymore. Turned in my badge after what happened to my brother." His expression darkened. "The territory judge said going after the Dawsons wasn't a priority. Too many other crimes, too few marshals. Suggested I let it go." "But you couldn't," Theresa surmised. "Would you?" he asked, looking directly at her. "No," she admitted. "I wouldn't." Around midday, they stopped by a small creek to water the horses and rest briefly. As Theresa stretched her legs, Kieran removed something from his saddlebag and approached her. "Time for that shooting lesson," he said, holding out a revolver smaller than his own. "Smith & Wesson pocket model, easier to handle than mine." Theresa took the gun gingerly, surprised by its weight. "I've only ever shot a rifle." "Principles are the same," Kieran said. "Respect the weapon, aim carefully, and remember that every bullet has consequences." He pointed to a dead tree about 20 paces away. "See that knot on the trunk? That's your target." For the next half hour, Kieran patiently instructed Theresa on the proper way to hold, aim, and fire the revolver. Her first few shots went wide, but by the end of the lesson, she was hitting near the knot more often than not. "You're a quick study," Kieran observed as she reloaded the gun. "Keep practicing whenever we stop, and remember only use it if absolutely necessary," Theresa finished for him. "I understand, Mr. Donovan. I'm not eager to shoot anyone." "Good," he said. "Let's hope it stays that way." They continued their journey, the landscape gradually changing as they rode. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and cacti, and in the distance, the faint outline of mountains began to take shape. "We should reach Silver Creek by nightfall," Kieran said as the afternoon wore on. "But we won't go in until morning. I want to scout the area first, see if the Dawsons are still there." "And if they are?" Theresa asked. "Then we watch and wait for the right moment," he replied. "Rushing in would be foolish." "You seem very methodical for a man on a mission of vengeance," she observed. Kieran gave her a sharp look. "Vengeance gets men killed, Miss Bennett. I prefer justice." "Is there a difference?" "Vengeance is blind," he said after a moment. "Justice sees clearly." As the sun began to set, they made camp in a sheltered arroyo a few miles east of Silver Creek. Kieran built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize visibility, and prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. Sitting across the fire from him, Theresa was struck by how different he looked in the firelight, less the hard-edged pursuer, and more simply a man, tired from a long day's ride, the weight of his mission evident in the set of his shoulders. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Donovan?" She ventured. He looked up from his coffee. "You can ask." "What will you do after you've settled with the Dawsons?" Kieran seemed surprised by the question, as if he hadn't considered it himself. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "You must have had plans before all this," Theresa pressed gently. "Before your brother." He was quiet for so long that Theresa thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I had a small ranch near Denver, nothing fancy, just enough land for a few horses and cattle. Was planning to settle there eventually." He stared into the fire. "Seems like another life now. It could still be your life," she suggested. "After." Kieran looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. "What about you, Miss Bennett? What will you do when you get your locket back?" "Rebuild," she said without hesitation. "The store, my life, it won't be easy, but it's all I know." "You could do something else," he pointed out. "Go somewhere new, start fresh." Theresa shook her head. "Marfa is my home. I won't let the Dawsons take that from me too." A hint of admiration showed in Kieran's eyes. "Your father would be proud of that spirit." The unexpected compliment warmed her more than the fire. "Thank you," she said softly. As the night deepened around them, Theresa wrapped herself in the blanket Kieran had provided and lay down near the fire. Despite the hard ground beneath her and the uncertainty ahead, she felt strangely at peace. For the first time since the raid, she had purpose, direction, and someone beside her who understood what had been taken from her. "Mr. Donovan," she murmured, already half asleep. "Yes, I'm glad you came to Marfa." There was a pause, then his quiet reply. "So am I, Miss Bennett, so am I." Dawn broke with a chill in the air that promised a hot day to follow. Theresa awoke to find Kieran already up, saddling the horses and checking his weapons with methodical precision. "We need to move," he said when he noticed her watching. "I scouted ahead while you were sleeping. The Dawsons are at Silver Creek, all right. Looks like they're holed up in the mining company office." Theresa sat up quickly. "All 6 of them. 5 that I could see," Kieran corrected. "The one you described with the yellow teeth wasn't visible. Could be inside or could have split from the group." "What's the plan?" Theresa asked, folding her blanket and accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "We'll approach from the east ridge," Kieran explained. "There's an abandoned miner's shack with a clear view of the office. You'll wait there while I work my way closer. And then I'll do what I came to do," he said simply. "Recover what was stolen and see that justice is served." "Alone?" Theresa asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "Against 5 of them." Kieran checked his Colt one last time before holstering it. "I've faced worse odds." "That's not as reassuring as you might think," Theresa said dryly. To her surprise, a genuine smile briefly crossed his face. "Your concern is noted, Miss Bennett, but this is why you're staying in the shack." His expression grew serious again. "If anything goes wrong, if I don't come back within an hour of entering that office, you ride back to Marfa as fast as Penny can carry you. Understand?" Theresa wanted to protest, but knew it would be futile. "I understand." They rode in tense silence for the remaining distance to Silver Creek, keeping to the higher ground where the scrub brush provided cover. The mining settlement came into view as they crested a small hill, a cluster of wooden buildings surrounding a mine entrance, with ore carts and equipment scattered about. Most of the structures looked abandoned, with only the larger office buildings showing signs of occupation. Horses tethered outside, smoke rising from the chimney. Kieran led them on a circuitous route to the eastern ridge, where the abandoned shack stood half hidden among boulder outcroppings. From this vantage point, they had an unobstructed view of the mining company office about a quarter-mile away. "Wait here," Kieran instructed as he dismounted and helped Theresa down from her horse. "Keep the horses quiet and stay out of sight." "How will you approach?" Theresa asked, scanning the open ground between the ridge and the office. "There's a dry creek bed that runs behind the buildings," he replied, pointing to a line of vegetation that indicated its path. "I'll follow that, then come up behind the office. And once you're there..." Kieran checked his gun belt one more time. "I'll improvise." "That's not much of a plan," Theresa said, anxiety knotting her stomach. "Plans rarely survive contact with men like the Dawsons," he said pragmatically. He hesitated, then added, "If I don't make it back, the mare is yours. She'll get you home." Before Theresa could respond, he turned to leave, but she caught his arm. "Kieran, wait." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it stopped him in his tracks. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Kieran nodded once, his blue eyes holding hers. "I will," he promised. Then he was gone, moving swiftly and silently down the ridge toward the creek bed. Theresa watched until he disappeared among the vegetation, then turned her attention to the mining office. Through a broken window of the shack, she could make out movement inside the building, shadows passing behind curtained windows, the occasional figure stepping onto the small porch before going back inside. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then half an hour. There was no sign of Kieran. Theresa found herself unconsciously fingering the small revolver he had given her, which now resided in the pocket of her riding skirt. A movement near the back of the office caught her eye, a shadow slipping around the corner of the building. Kieran. He had made it to the office undetected. Theresa held her breath as she watched him pause at the back door, then slowly ease it open and disappear inside. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The office appeared quiet from the outside, giving no indication of what might be occurring within. Theresa strained to hear any sound, a shout, a gunshot, but the distance was too great. Then, without warning, the front door of the office burst open, and two men tumbled out onto the porch, locked in violent struggle. Even from a distance, Theresa recognized Kieran's distinctive duster coat. He was fighting with the red bandana-wearing leader of the Dawson Gang. A shot rang out, then another. More of the gang members emerged from the office, weapons drawn. Theresa's heart leapt into her throat as she saw Kieran break free from Dawson's grip and dive behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood around him. "No," she whispered, watching helplessly as the gang members spread out, clearly intending to flank Kieran's position. Without conscious thought, Theresa found herself moving toward the horses. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to wait, to flee if necessary, but she couldn't just watch as Kieran was cut down before her eyes. She mounted Penny in one fluid motion and, drawing the revolver, urged the mare down the ridge toward the mining office. The sound of gunfire covered her approach until she was nearly upon them. One of the gang members, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard, turned at the sound of hoofbeats just as Theresa leveled the Smith & Wesson at him. "Drop your weapons," she shouted, her voice stronger and steadier than she felt. The unexpected command from behind caused momentary confusion among the Dawson Gang. Kieran seized the opportunity, firing twice from his position behind the trough, dropping one of the men instantly. What followed was a chaotic blur of action. Theresa fired at the bearded man as he raised his gun toward her, her shot going wide but causing him to dive for cover. Kieran emerged from behind the trough, firing with deadly precision at another gang member. Jack Dawson, seeing his men falling, made a break for the horses tethered nearby. Theresa wheeled Penny around, intending to cut him off, but Dawson was faster. He reached his mount and swung up into the saddle, a bulging saddlebag clutched against his chest. "The locket," Theresa cried out, recognizing her mother's keepsake dangling from the bag. Without thinking, she spurred Penny forward in pursuit. "Theresa, no!" Kieran's shout came from behind her, but she was already committed, racing after Dawson as he fled toward the open desert. The chase was short but intense, with Penny proving her worth as she gained ground on Dawson's overloaded mount. Theresa fired once, missing but causing Dawson to look back. In that moment of distraction, his horse stumbled slightly, and the saddlebag slipped from his grip, tumbling to the ground. Dawson cursed but didn't stop, clearly valuing his freedom more than his stolen goods. Theresa reined Penny to a halt beside the fallen bag, her heart pounding. She dismounted quickly, snatching up the saddlebag just as the sound of another horse approached rapidly from behind. Kieran pulled his stallion to a hard stop beside her, his expression a mixture of anger and relief. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, scanning the horizon where Dawson had disappeared. "My mother's locket," Theresa explained, opening the bag to reveal not only her precious keepsake, but also various stolen items, watches, rings, and a considerable amount of cash, including what she recognized as the contents of her strongbox. "It's all here." Kieran's anger seemed to deflate slightly at the sight of her joy. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," she pointed out, clutching the locket to her chest. "And neither were you, which might not have been the case if I'd stayed hidden." Kieran couldn't argue with that logic. "What happened to following my instructions without question?" "I questioned them," Theresa said simply, "and found them wanting." To her surprise, a reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Remind me never to play poker with you, Miss Bennett. You're full of surprises." "Theresa," she corrected him. "I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" His smile grew slightly. "I suppose we are, Theresa." Their moment of connection was broken by the sound of groaning from the direction of the mining office. One of the Dawson gang was still alive, though wounded. "We need to secure the survivors," Kieran said, his expression turning serious again, "and see what else they've stolen." They returned to the office to find 2 gang members dead, one seriously wounded, and one the bearded man Theresa had shot at attempting to crawl toward a discarded weapon. Kieran quickly disarmed him and bound both surviving outlaws with rope he found in the office. Inside, the building had been turned into the gang's temporary hideout, with bedrolls scattered across the floor and stolen goods piled on what had once been the mine manager's desk. Among the items, Kieran found a leather portfolio that made his expression darken. "What is it?" Theresa asked, still clutching her recovered locket. "Deeds," Kieran replied grimly, "to properties all over the territory, including this mine." He opened one document. "This belongs to a family in El Paso, signed over to Jack Dawson 3 days ago." "Forced signatures," Theresa surmised. Kieran nodded. "The Dawsons have been doing more than simple robbery. They've been forcing property owners to sign over their land before killing them." He closed the portfolio with a snap. "The law will be very interested in this." "What about Dawson himself?" Theresa asked. "He got away." "For now," Kieran said, his determination evident. "But he's alone and we know which direction he's headed. He won't get far." As they secured the prisoners and gathered the stolen goods, Theresa found herself watching Kieran, the efficiency of his movements, the fairness with which he treated even the outlaws, ensuring the wounded man received basic treatment. This was a man of principle, she realized, not just vengeance. "You're still a lawman at heart," she observed as they prepared to transport the prisoners and recovered goods back to Marfa. Kieran looked up from where he was securing the portfolio. "Some things you can't leave behind, I suppose." "What about your brother?" Theresa asked gently. "Will this bring you peace?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "Not peace," he finally said, "but maybe a step toward justice. Jack Dawson is still out there, though. And we'll find him," Theresa said with certainty. "Together." Kieran's eyebrows rose. "Together." "Unless you plan to leave me behind again," she challenged. which, as we've established, doesn't work particularly well. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, I suppose it doesn't. He studied her for a moment. You're not what I expected when I rode into Marfa, Theresa Bennett. And what did you expect, Kieran Donovan? Not someone who would chase down an outlaw for a locket, he said. Not someone this brave. The simple compliment warmed her more than she cared to admit. Well, you're stuck with me now, at least until we find Jack Dawson. At least until then, Kieran agreed, and something in his tone suggested that perhaps he wouldn't mind if it were longer. The ride back to Marfa took the better part of 2 days, with the prisoners slowing their progress. They arrived to find the town in an uproar over the news that most of the notorious Dawson Gang had been captured or killed, with only Jack Dawson himself still at large. Sheriff Walters was both impressed and somewhat put out by their success. Could have used some official involvement, he grumbled as he locked up the prisoners. Consider this official enough, Kieran replied, handing over the portfolio of deeds. These need to get to the federal marshal's office in El Paso, evidence of the Dawsons' larger scheme. As word spread of the recovered stolen goods, townspeople began arriving at the sheriff's office to claim their property. Theresa stood to the side, watching with satisfaction as items were returned to their rightful owners, her mother's locket now safely around her neck where it belonged. Quite a thing you did, a voice said beside her. She turned to find Mrs. Porter, the boarding house owner, regarding her with newfound respect. Going after those outlaws. Mr. Donovan did most of it, Theresa said modestly. Mrs. Porter's knowing gaze shifted between Theresa and Kieran, who was across the room speaking with the sheriff. That man rode into town looking for the Dawsons, but I think he found something else entirely. Before Theresa could respond to this cryptic observation, Kieran approached them, touching his hat respectfully to Mrs. Porter. Madam, Mr. Donovan, Mrs. Porter acknowledged. I trust you'll be staying on in Marfa a while longer. Your room is still available. Kieran glanced at Theresa. I appreciate the offer, but I'll be heading out tomorrow. Jack Dawson is still free and his trail will only get colder. Disappointment flashed through Theresa, though she tried to hide it. So soon? The sooner I find him, the sooner this ends, Kieran replied. Then more gently he added, I'll return when it's done. I see, Theresa said, struggling to keep her voice neutral. Well, thank you for everything you've done, for the town and for me, Mrs. Porter, sensing the tension, tactfully excused herself, leaving them alone in the corner of the busy office. Theresa, Kieran began, his voice low. What I said before about going together, it's fine, she interrupted. I understand. This is your mission, not mine. That's not, he stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. It's because it's dangerous. Dawson knows my face now and yours. He'll be desperate, which makes him more dangerous than before. And I've already proven I can handle danger, Theresa countered. Or have you forgotten? Kieran's expression softened. I haven't forgotten anything about you. The simple statement, delivered in his quiet, steady voice, made her heart skip a beat. Then let me help you finish this, she insisted. Let me be part of bringing him to justice. You have a life to rebuild here, he reminded her. Your store, my store, is ashes, Theresa said firmly. It can stay ashes a little longer. Kieran studied her face, searching for something. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he finally nodded. We leave at dawn. Pack light. Relief and excitement flooded through her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. The road ahead won't be easy. Theresa reached out, her fingers briefly touching his arm. Few worthwhile things are. The next morning, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Theresa waited by the livery stable with a small pack containing only the essentials. She had spent the night in Mrs. Porter's boarding house, carefully considering what lay ahead. The sensible part of her knew that riding off with Kieran Donovan in pursuit of a dangerous outlaw was foolhardy at best, potentially fatal at worst. Yet something deeper than sense was driving her decisions now, a need for closure, for justice, and perhaps something more that she wasn't quite ready to name. Kieran arrived exactly when he said he would, leading both horses, already saddled and ready for the journey. He wore the same clothes as when she'd first seen him, but there was something different about him now, a lightness perhaps, as if some of the burden he carried had been lifted. "Ready?" he asked simply. Theresa nodded. "Where are we headed?" "Southwest," Kieran replied as he helped her mount. The sheriff received word that a man matching Dawson's description was seen near the border town of Presidio 2 days ago. "The border?" Theresa asked. "You think he's planning to flee to Mexico?" "It would be the smart play," Kieran agreed, swinging up onto his own horse. But Dawson's ego might prevent him from running too far. He spent years building his reputation in this territory. Men like that don't abandon their hunting grounds easily. They rode out of Marfa as the town began to stir, following the road southwest toward the distant border. The morning was cool, with a breeze that carried the scent of sage and dust. For the first few hours, they rode in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "Tell me about your brother," Theresa finally said as they stopped briefly to water the horses at a small stream. Kieran looked surprised by the request, but after a moment he nodded. "Thomas was 3 years younger than me. Always the sensible one, farmer, family man, never looked for trouble." A faint smile touched his lips. "Used to say I got all the recklessness in the family. Was he right?" "Probably," Kieran admitted. "I spent my youth chasing adventure before I found purpose in a marshal's badge. Thomas found his purpose in his land and his family." His expression darkened. He deserved better than what he got. "And your nephew?" Theresa asked gently. "What's he like?" "Samuel," Kieran said, his voice softening. "Smart boy, quiet since it happened, but my sister says he's beginning to talk again, to smile sometimes." He looked out over the landscape. "He has his father's eyes. You miss him." It wasn't a question, but Kieran answered anyway. "Every day." "He's all that's left of Thomas now." Theresa touched his arm lightly. "When this is over, you should go to him, be the family he needs." Kieran covered her hand with his own, the brief touch conveying more than words could. "That's the plan." As they remounted and continued their journey, Theresa found herself studying Kieran's profile against the vast Texas sky. This was a man who had known loss, who understood what it meant to have everything taken away, yet he had not allowed it to consume him, to turn him bitter or cruel. Instead, it had forged in him a determination to right wrongs, to restore what could be restored. In that moment, Theresa realized that her feelings for this quiet, principled man had grown beyond gratitude or admiration. There was something deeper taking root, something that both exhilarated and terrified her. The realization must have shown on her face because Kieran glanced over at her with a questioning look. "Something wrong?" "No," Theresa replied, grateful that he couldn't read her thoughts. "Just thinking about what happens after we find Dawson." "One step at a time," Kieran advised, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary. "First, we find him, then we'll figure out the rest." They reached Presidio by nightfall, a dusty border town where Mexican and American cultures blended along the narrow streets. Unlike Marfa, Presidio never truly seemed to sleep. Oil lamps burned in cantinas and saloons, music and laughter spilled into the streets, and the scent of spiced meat and cigarette smoke hung in the air. Kieran led them to a modest boarding house on the edge of town, run by a gray-haired Mexican woman who greeted him with recognition. "Señor Donovan," she said warmly, "it has been many months." "Señora Vasquez," Kieran replied with a respectful nod. "We need rooms for the night if you have them." "For you, always," the woman assured him, her curious gaze shifting to Theresa. "And the señorita, Miss Bennett," Kieran introduced her. "A friend." Something knowing flickered in the older woman's eyes. "Ah, a friend, I understand." "It's not," Kieran began, but Señora Vasquez was already waving away his protest. "2 rooms side by side," she declared, leading them upstairs. "Very proper." Theresa bit back a smile at Kieran's discomfort. When they were alone in the hallway between their assigned rooms, she couldn't resist teasing him. "A friend, Mr. Donovan," Kieran's ears reddened slightly. "Would you prefer associate, fellow pursuer of justice?" "Friend will do," Theresa said, still smiling. "For now." His eyebrows rose at the implied "for now," but before he could respond, she continued more seriously. "What's our plan for finding Dawson?" Kieran accepted the change of subject with visible relief. "I have contacts in town, people who notice strangers, especially those carrying too much money or asking about crossing the border. We'll start making inquiries in the morning. And tonight we rest," he said firmly, "and stay out of sight. If Dawson is still in Presidio, I don't want him knowing we're here until we're ready to move." Theresa nodded her understanding. "Good night, then, Kieran." "Good night, Theresa," he replied softly. "Lock your door." Morning brought clear skies and a bustling town. After a simple breakfast of tortillas, beans, and strong coffee provided by Señora Vasquez, Kieran and Theresa set out to gather information. Kieran had changed into clothes less distinctive than his usual attire, a simple cotton shirt and vest that helped him blend in with the local population. "We'll split up," he told Theresa as they walked toward the town center. "Cover more ground that way." Theresa frowned. "Is that safe?" "Safer than both of us being spotted together," Kieran reasoned. "You check the general store and the post office, places where women won't raise eyebrows. I'll handle the saloons and stables." "What exactly am I looking for?" "Information," Kieran replied. "Casual questions about strangers in town, particularly a man matching Dawson's description. Listen more than you talk. And if you see Dawson himself, I find you immediately," Theresa finished. "I remember." They agreed to meet back at the boarding house at noon and parted ways at the main square. Theresa headed first to the general store, where she browsed fabric bolts while listening to the gossip of the shopkeeper and his customers. Her inquiries about new arrivals in town yielded little useful information beyond confirmation that several Anglo travelers had indeed passed through in recent days. The post office proved more promising. As she waited in line to inquire about mail service to Marfa, she overheard the postmaster speaking with a clerk about a man who had paid extra for information about the next mail coach to Chihuahua. "Nervous type," the postmaster was saying. "Kept looking over his shoulder like the devil himself was after him. Red bandana around his neck, though he tried to hide it under his collar." Theresa's heart quickened. The description matched Jack Dawson perfectly. "When was this?" the clerk asked. "Yesterday afternoon," the postmaster replied. "Said he'd be back today to purchase passage." Theresa waited until she could slip away without drawing attention, then hurried back toward the boarding house, hoping to find Kieran already returned. The streets were crowded with midday traffic, merchants selling their wares, laborers taking their lunch breaks, children running errands for their parents. As she turned a corner near the boarding house, a hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind, while another arm wrapped around her waist, dragging her into a narrow alley between buildings. Theresa struggled fiercely, trying to scream through the hand that muffled her cries. "Stop fighting or I'll cut your pretty throat," a harsh voice growled in her ear. Theresa froze, recognizing the voice instantly. Jack Dawson. He spun her around, keeping one hand over her mouth while the other pressed a knife against her ribs. His face, with its distinctive scarred eyebrow, was twisted in a hateful snarl. "Thought I wouldn't recognize you," he hissed. "The girl from the store, riding with that interfering bastard who killed my men." He pressed the knife harder, just enough to sting without breaking skin. "Where is he?" Theresa remained silent, glaring at him with all the defiance she could muster. Dawson's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Doesn't matter," he decided. "He'll come looking when you don't return, and I'll be waiting." He began dragging her deeper into the alley, toward a door at the back of one of the buildings. "You're my ticket out of this mess, girl." Theresa remembered the small revolver hidden in the pocket of her skirt, but with Dawson's grip on her, she couldn't reach it without him noticing. She would have to wait for an opportunity, a moment of distraction. That moment came sooner than expected. As Dawson pulled her toward the door, a stray dog darted across their path, startling him. His grip loosened for just an instant, but it was enough. Theresa bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth while simultaneously driving her elbow back into his stomach. Dawson cursed and stumbled back, momentarily winded. Theresa tore herself from his grasp and reached for her gun, but Dawson recovered quickly. He lunged forward, knife extended, just as she drew the revolver. The gunshot echoed through the narrow alley, shockingly loud in the confined space. Dawson staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt. The knife clattered to the ground from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "You," he gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You shot me." Theresa kept the gun pointed steadily at him, though her hand trembled slightly. "You shouldn't have come back for me." Dawson sank to his knees, one hand pressed against the wound in his chest. "Didn't think a store girl would have the nerve." His words trailed off as he collapsed forward onto the dirt of the alley. For a moment, Theresa stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened washing over her. Then the sound of running footsteps snapped her back to awareness. "Theresa!" Kieran's voice called out, frantic with worry. He appeared at the entrance to the alley, gun drawn, his eyes quickly taking in the scene before him, Theresa standing with the smoking revolver still in her hand, Dawson's motionless form on the ground. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, gently taking the gun from her shaking hand. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his free hand moving to her face, tilting it up to examine her. "No," she managed to say. He grabbed me, knew who I was. Said he was going to use me to get to you." Kieran's expression darkened as he knelt beside Dawson's body, checking for a pulse he already knew wouldn't be there. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly, standing to face her again. "You defended yourself." Theresa nodded numbly, the full impact of the moment still not quite real to her. "It's over then, truly over." "Yes," Kieran confirmed, holstering his own weapon and carefully placing her revolver in his coat pocket. "It's over." People were beginning to gather at the mouth of the alley, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. Kieran put his arm around Theresa's shoulders, shielding her from their curious gazes as he led her out. "Make way," he commanded in a voice that brooked no argument. "Local authorities have been summoned." The crowd parted reluctantly, whispers following them as Kieran guided Theresa back to the boarding house. Senora Vasquez took one look at Theresa's pale face and Kieran's protective stance, and immediately ushered them into a private sitting room, closing the door firmly behind them. "Sit," she instructed Theresa, pressing a glass of amber liquid into her hands. "Drink. It helps with the shock." Theresa obediently took a sip, coughing slightly as the brandy burned its way down her throat. Kieran remained standing, his expression troubled as he watched her. I need to speak with the local sheriff, he said after a moment. Explain what happened. I'll come with you, Theresa said, starting to rise. Kieran gently pressed her back into her seat. Not yet, rest first. I'll handle the initial explanations. His voice softened. Trust me, Theresa. This wasn't your fault. She nodded slowly, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. She had taken a man's life. Self-defense or not, it was a weight she would carry from this day forward. He was going to kill me, she said quietly. And then you. I know, Kieran assured her, crouching down to meet her eyes. You did the right thing, the only thing you could do. Theresa looked up at him, finding strength in his steady gaze. Go, she said finally. Do what needs to be done, I'll be all right. Kieran hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so unexpected and tender that it momentarily pushed aside the horror of the day. I'll return as soon as I can, he promised, rising to his feet. Senora Vasquez will stay with you. The older woman nodded firmly. No one bothers my guests. Go, Senor Donovan. After Kieran had gone, Theresa sat quietly, sipping the brandy and trying to process everything that had happened. Senora Vasquez bustled about, providing a light meal that Theresa couldn't eat and speaking softly in a mixture of Spanish and English that was oddly comforting in its normalcy. He cares for you very much, the older woman observed after a while. I see it in his eyes. Theresa looked up from her untouched plate. We've only known each other a short time. Senora Vasquez made a dismissive noise. Time means nothing to the heart. My husband asked me to marry him after 2 weeks. We had 50 years together before God called him home. She studied Theresa's face. When life is uncertain, as it is out here, we must seize happiness where we find it. Before Theresa could respond, the door opened and Kieran returned, accompanied by a harried-looking man in a dusty badge. Miss Bennett, the sheriff said, removing his hat. I'm Sheriff Morales. Mr. Donovan has explained the situation, but I need to hear your account of what happened. Theresa straightened her shoulders and told her story clearly and concisely, from her discovery at the post office to Dawson's attack and her response. The sheriff listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small book. The postmaster confirms your story about Dawson inquiring about passage to Chihuahua, he said when she had finished, and there are wanted posters for him all over the territory. As far as I'm concerned, you've done us all a service. He closed his notebook with finality. Self-defense, clear and simple. Case closed. Relief washed over Theresa, though it didn't entirely dispel the heaviness in her heart. What happens now? She asked. Now, the sheriff said, you go home and try to put this behind you. Dawson was a bad man who chose his path. You just happened to be the end of it. After the sheriff had gone, Kieran sat beside Theresa on the small settee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him but not so close as to crowd her. Are you truly all right? He asked softly. Theresa considered the question honestly. Not entirely, she admitted. But I will be, I think. In time. Kieran nodded, understanding. The first time is the hardest, he said, a statement that reminded Theresa of how different their lives had been until now. Does it get easier? She asked, not entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. It shouldn't, Kieran replied seriously. Taking a life should never be easy, even when it's necessary. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. What happens now? Theresa finally asked, echoing her earlier question to the sheriff, but looking for a different answer. Kieran seemed to understand what she was really asking. Now we go back to Marfa if that's what you want. You rebuild your store, your life. He paused. Unless you've changed your mind about that, and you, Theresa pressed. What will you do now that your mission is complete? Kieran looked down at his hands, then back up to meet her eyes. I meant what I said about seeing my nephew, about being the family he needs. He hesitated. But I've been thinking about what comes after that. Theresa waited, her heart beating a little faster. I still have that land near Denver, Kieran continued. It's good land, could support a family, could be a place to build something new. His blue eyes held hers steadily. If there was someone who might be interested in building it with me. The implication was clear, and Theresa found herself momentarily speechless. They had known each other for such a short time, yet in that time they had faced death together, saved each other, seen the best and worst of what life on the frontier could bring. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Kieran Donovan?" she finally managed. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Not yet. That would be too soon, even for me." The smile faded into something more serious. "But I am asking if you might consider a future that looks different from the one you planned, a future that includes me." Theresa thought of Marfa, of the ashes of her store and the life she had imagined rebuilding there. It had been her father's dream, not truly hers. And now there was another possibility before her, a chance at something new, with a man who had promised to give her back everything she had lost, and had somehow given her so much more. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like very much to see this land of yours, to meet your nephew." She took a deep breath, to see if perhaps it could become our land, our home. The smile that broke across Kieran's face was like sunrise after the longest night, warm and full of promise. He reached out and took her hand in his, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that spoke of both tenderness and respect. "Then that's where we'll start," he said simply. "One step at a time." Theresa felt as though a weight had lifted from her shoulders. The day's events were still there, the memory of Dawson's death still fresh. But alongside, it was something new and hopeful, the beginning of a future she had never imagined. "One step at a time," she agreed. And for the first time since the Dawson Gang had ridden into her store, she felt truly certain that everything would be all right. The journey from Presidio back to Marfa was considerably lighter in spirit than their outward journey had been. With Jack Dawson dead, and the rest of his gang either dead or in custody, a sense of completion hung in the air. The stolen goods recovered from Silver Creek had been returned to their owners or entrusted to Sheriff Morales for distribution, and the portfolio of deeds was on its way to El Paso, where the rightful owners could be notified. They rode at a leisurely pace, taking time to appreciate the wild beauty of the Texas landscape, the distant purple mountains, the wide open skies, the surprising bursts of color from wildflowers that somehow found the strength to bloom in this harsh environment. It was as if both of them were seeing it anew, through eyes no longer focused solely on pursuit and vengeance. On their second night on the trail, camped beside a small spring that created an oasis of green amid the arid surroundings, Kieran told Theresa more about his land in Colorado, the clear streams full of trout, the stands of aspen that turned gold in the autumn, the distant peaks that remained snow-capped even in summer. "It sounds beautiful," Theresa said, trying to picture it. "Very different from Texas." "Different, but with its own kind of wildness," Kieran agreed. "The winters are harder, but the summers are glorious." He hesitated. "My brother always said it was a good place to raise children." The implication hung in the air between them, neither uncomfortable nor presumptuous, simply a possibility, a future they were beginning to envision together. "And your sister? Where does she live in Denver?" Theresa asked. "She has a house in the city itself," Kieran replied. "Her husband is a banker. They've been good to Samuel, taking him in without hesitation. Will he want to leave them, to live with you instead?" Kieran considered this. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "He's settled there now, beginning to heal. I wouldn't want to disrupt that." He stared into the fire. Maybe he could split his time between us, at least at first, visit during school holidays. "That sounds sensible," Theresa said. "Give him time to adjust to the idea." Kieran looked at her with appreciation. "You have a gift for seeing the practical path." "Years of running a store," she said with a smile. "You learn to solve problems before they arise." "A useful skill for ranching as well," Kieran observed, "and for life in general." They arrived back in Marfa 3 days later to find the town buzzing with the news of Jack Dawson's death. The story had traveled faster than they had, embellished with each telling, until Theresa was portrayed as a sharpshooting heroine who had faced down the notorious outlaw without flinching. "Not exactly how I remember it," she murmured to Kieran as they listened to the excited recounting from Miss Porter, who had insisted on feeding them a proper meal their first evening back. "Stories have a way of growing," he replied quietly. "Best to let them. Makes folks feel safer to think the villains always get what they deserve in the end." That evening, after dinner, they walked together through Marfa, eventually stopping before the charred remains of Theresa's store. In the weeks since the fire, someone had cleared away some of the debris, but the foundation and partial walls still stood as a stark reminder of what had been lost. "I should feel more," Theresa said, surprised by her own detachment. "This was my home, my livelihood." "Sometimes when we lose something, we discover it wasn't what we truly needed," Kieran suggested. "Or wanted." Theresa nodded slowly. "My father loved this store. It was his dream, his legacy. I took it on because it was expected, because it was the responsible thing to do." She looked up at Kieran, "But it was never truly mine." "What was truly yours?" he asked. "What did Theresa Bennett dream of before the Dawson Gang rode into town?" She considered the question seriously. "Freedom, I think. Not from responsibility, but the freedom to choose my own path." She smiled ruefully. "Ironic that I had to lose everything to find it." Kieran's arm slipped around her shoulders, a gesture that was becoming familiar and welcome. "Sometimes life works that way. The worst moments can lead to the best beginnings." They stood together in the gathering dusk, contemplating the ruins that represented an ending and the future that stretched before them, full of possibility. The next week was filled with practical matters, settling Theresa's affairs in Marfa, deciding what few possessions she would take with her, saying goodbye to the people who had been part of her life for so long. To her surprise, many of the townspeople expressed genuine sadness at her departure. "Won't be the same without you, Miss Bennett," Sheriff Walters said gruffly when she stopped by his office. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled yourself through all this." "Thank you, Sheriff," Theresa replied, touched by his words. "I like to think he would understand why I need to leave." "Oh, he'd understand all right," the sheriff said with a knowing glance toward Kieran, who was waiting outside. "Man would have to be blind not to see what's between you two." Theresa felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't deny it. What was between them was still new and developing, but it was real and growing stronger each day. On their final evening in Marfa, Kieran took Theresa to dinner at the town's only restaurant, a special occasion that had her wearing her best remaining dress, a deep blue affair that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "You look beautiful," Kieran said as he held her chair, the sincerity in his voice making the simple compliment feel profound. "Thank you," Theresa replied, equally sincere. "For everything, Kieran, not just the compliment." He understood what she meant. "I made you a promise that night in the street," he reminded her, "that I would give you back everything they took. And you've given me far more," Theresa said softly, "a future I never imagined." Kieran reached across the table and took her hand in his. "There's something I need to ask you, Theresa, something I've been thinking about since Presidio." Theresa's heart quickened. "Yes, When we get to Denver, he began, before we head out to the ranch, I'd like you to meet my sister, and Samuel, he hesitated, as my intended. Theresa's breath caught. Are you asking me to marry you, Kieran Donovan? I am, he confirmed, his blue eyes steady on hers. I know it hasn't been long, and if you need more time, I understand. But I know what I want, who I want to build a life with. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. I love you, Theresa Bennett. I think I have since that first night when you stood up despite having lost everything. Tears welled in Theresa's eyes, but they were tears of joy. I love you too, she whispered. And yes, I will marry you. I don't need more time to know that you're the man I want to spend my life with. Kieran's smile was radiant as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. It was my mother's, he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. One of the few things I've kept with me all these years. Theresa looked down at the ring, then back up at the man who had changed her life so completely in so short a time. It's perfect, she said simply. They left Marfa 2 days later, heading north toward a new life. The journey to Denver would take weeks, but neither minded the prospect of time on the trail together. Each day brought them closer not only to their destination but to each other, as they shared stories, dreams, and plans for the future. They arrived in Denver in the early autumn, when the city was alive with color, and the first crispness of the changing season tinged the air. Kieran's sister Alina lived in a handsome brick house in one of the city's better neighborhoods, a testament to her husband's success in banking. Alina Donovan Whitfield was a tall woman with the same striking blue eyes as her brother, though her hair was lighter, shot through with silver despite her relatively young age. She greeted Kieran with a fierce hug, then turned to Theresa with warm curiosity. So you're the woman who's captured my nomadic brother's heart, she said, taking Theresa's hands in hers. Welcome to our family, Theresa. Thank you, Theresa replied, immediately liking this straightforward woman. I'm very happy to meet you. Uncle Kieran. A small voice came from the doorway behind Alina. A boy of about 7 stood there, his dark hair and blue eyes marking him unmistakably as Kieran's nephew. He was thin, with a serious expression that seemed too old for his years, but there was a spark of hope in his face as he looked at his uncle. Kieran knelt down to the boy's level. "Hello, Samuel," he said softly. "I've missed you." For a moment the boy hesitated. Then he launched himself into Kieran's arms, burying his face against his uncle's shoulder. Kieran held him tightly, his eyes closing briefly as he absorbed the impact of this reunion. "I told you I'd come back," he murmured into the boy's hair, "and I always keep my promises." When they finally separated, Kieran turned to include Theresa. "Samuel, I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Miss Bennett, Theresa. She's going to be your aunt." Samuel regarded Theresa with solemn curiosity. "Are you going to live at Uncle Kieran's ranch?" "Yes, I am," Theresa confirmed, crouching down to his level as Kieran had done. "I hope we can be good friends, Samuel." The boy considered this, then asked with the directness of childhood, "Do you know how to make cookies? Aunt Alina makes good cookies." Theresa laughed, relieved by the simple question. "I do know how to make cookies, and pies and cakes too." This seemed to satisfy some internal criteria because Samuel nodded decisively. "That's good. Uncle Kieran can't cook very well." Kieran's surprised laugh joined Theresa's, and even Alina was smiling. It was, Theresa thought, a perfect beginning to their new family. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the garden of Alina's home. Theresa wore a new dress of ivory silk, with her mother's locket around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. Kieran, clean-shaven and solemn in a new suit, watched her approach with an expression of such wonder that Theresa felt her heart might burst with happiness. Samuel served as ring-bearer, carefully carrying the simple gold bands on a small velvet cushion. Eleanor stood as witness, along with her husband George, a jovial man with a quick laugh who had welcomed Theresa as warmly as his wife had. The minister spoke of commitment, of building a life together through good times and bad, of the sacred bond between husband and wife. But it was the vows, spoken in Kieran's deep, steady voice and Theresa's clear, confident one, that truly moved those present. "I take you, Theresa, to be my wife," Kieran said, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever life brings us, to honor and cherish you, to be faithful to you alone, and to love you with all that I am for all of my days." "I take you, Kieran, to be my husband," Theresa responded, her voice strong despite the tears of joy that threatened. "I promise to face each day with you in partnership and trust, to honor and cherish you, to be faithful to you alone, and to love you with all that I am for all of my days." The simple gold bands were exchanged. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Kieran kissed his bride with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the man he was and the husband he would be. The celebration that followed was joyous but intimate. Good food, wine, music, and the company of the small circle that now constituted their family. Samuel, initially shy, eventually warmed to the festivities, especially when Kieran swept Theresa into an impromptu dance on the garden lawn, then extended his hand to the boy to join them. The three of them, dancing together in the autumn sunlight, felt like a promise fulfilled, the beginning of the family they would become. 1 week after the wedding, they set out for Kieran's ranch, a day's ride northwest of Denver. Samuel came with them, his small face alight with excitement at the prospect of seeing the ranch again. He rode in front of Kieran on the big stallion, chattering about the animals he hoped to see and the things he wanted to show Theresa. The ranch itself exceeded Theresa's expectations. Nestled in a valley with mountains rising behind it and a clear stream running through the property, the main house was a sturdy 2-story structure built of logs and stone. A large barn stood nearby, along with corrals and a bunkhouse for the handful of hands Kieran employed to maintain the place during his long absence. "It's beautiful," Theresa breathed as they reined to a halt in front of the house. "Truly beautiful." Kieran helped Samuel down, then extended his hand to assist Theresa, though she was perfectly capable of dismounting on her own. When her feet touched the ground, he surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed, her arms instinctively going around his neck. "Carrying my wife over the threshold of our home," he replied seriously, though his eyes danced with joy. "It's tradition." Samuel watched them with a mixture of curiosity and amusement as Kieran carried Theresa up the porch steps and through the front door into the house that would be their home. The interior was simple but well crafted, with large windows that filled the rooms with light and offered views of the spectacular landscape outside. The furniture was solid and practical, with touches of a hand-woven blanket here, a carved wooden box there that hinted at Kieran's appreciation for craftsmanship. "What do you think?" he asked as he set Theresa down in the main room, a hint of uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Theresa interrupted, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Absolutely perfect." Samuel tugged at Kieran's sleeve. "Can I show her my room? The one you said would be mine when I visited." Kieran nodded. "Go ahead." As Samuel led Theresa upstairs to show her the small bedroom that would be his, Kieran watched them go, his expression one of profound contentment. This was what he had fought for, What he had pursued justice for, not just vengeance for what was lost, but the chance to build something new and good. The first year on the ranch passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Kieran and Theresa settled into married life with a naturalness that belied their whirlwind courtship. They complemented each other, well, his quiet strength and her practical determination making them effective partners in both life and work. Samuel spent the school year with Alina and George in Denver, but holidays and summers found him at the ranch, where he thrived in the open air and under the loving guidance of his uncle and new aunt. The shadows that had haunted his eyes after his parents' deaths gradually receded, replaced by the normal exuberance of childhood. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Theresa shared news that filled Kieran with a joy he had scarcely imagined possible. A baby. He repeated when she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "We're going to have a baby." Theresa nodded, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "In the autumn, just after harvest time, the doctor thinks." Kieran gathered her into his arms, his kiss expressing what words could not: his gratitude, his love, his anticipation of this new chapter in their lives. "I hope it's a boy," he murmured against her hair, "with your spirit and determination." "And if it's a girl?" Theresa asked, leaning back to see his face. "Then she'll be as beautiful and brave as her mother," Kieran replied without hesitation. "And I'll be wrapped around her little finger from the moment she arrives." They shared the news with Samuel on his next visit, uncertain how the now 9-year-old would react to the prospect of a cousin who would, in many ways, be more like a sibling. "So I'll be like a big brother?" he asked, processing the information. "Yes," Theresa confirmed. "The baby will look up to you, learn from you." Samuel considered this seriously, then nodded with decision. "I'll teach him to ride and fish and all the important things." "Him?" Kieran asked with amusement. "It might be a girl, you know," Samuel shrugged. "That's okay too. Girls can fish and ride." He glanced at Theresa with admiration. "Aunt Theresa can shoot better than most men." Theresa laughed, touched by the boy's assessment. "Let's hope this little one doesn't need to learn that particular skill anytime soon." Thomas Donovan was born on a crisp October evening, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. He had Kieran's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair, but Theresa's determined chin and expressive mouth. Kieran held his son with a mixture of awe and terror, this tiny being who represented everything he and Theresa had built together, everything they hoped for the future. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand, which immediately curled around his finger with surprising strength. "He's strong," Theresa observed from the bed, tired but radiant with the joy of new motherhood. "Like his father." When Samuel came for Christmas that year, he approached his infant cousin with careful curiosity that quickly turned to protective affection. He spoke to the baby with grave seriousness, explaining important matters like how to tell a good horse from a mediocre one, and why the stream behind the house had the best fishing spots. Watching them together, Theresa felt her heart swell with love for this family they had created, not in the conventional way, perhaps, but no less real or precious for that. "Happy?" Kieran asked, coming to stand beside her as she watched Samuel showing little Thomas a wooden toy he had carved himself. "More than I ever thought possible," Theresa replied honestly, leaning into his embrace. "When the Dawsons rode into my store that day, I thought my life was over. I never imagined it was just beginning." Kieran pressed a kiss to her temple. "I told you I'd give you back everything they took," he reminded her. "I keep my promises." "You gave me so much more," Theresa said softly, turning in his arms to face him. "You gave me a home, a family, a love I never expected to find." She reached up to touch his face, the face that had become dearer to her than any other. "You gave me yourself. And you gave me a reason to stop seeking vengeance and start building a future," Kieran replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved me, Theresa, in every way that matters." As they stood together, watching the boy who had become their son in all but name and the baby who was the physical embodiment of their love, Theresa thought of how far they had come from that dusty street in Marfa where they had first met. They had both lost everything once family, home, purpose. But in finding each other, they had found something greater than what had been taken from them. They had found a love that healed, that built rather than destroyed, that looked forward rather than back. And in the end, that was everything.